Hey there, this is Jen T. Grace, founder of Publish Your Purpose, and I am here with Loren Sanders, the author of Empathy is Not a Weakness. Hello, Loren.
Hi, Jen.
Uh, I am happy and excited for you that your book is finally here and it's launch, kind of like launch day, launch period, launch month, all of those fun things. I feel like in your case, sometimes we're talking about a book and it's not super clear what the book is about. But I feel like in your case, it is very clear what your book is about. But do you want to just share a little bit about kind of you and your background and then how your book came to be?
Sure. By day, I work as an enterprise learning leader at CVS Health, and I also do instruction at Lake Forest Graduate School of Management's MBA program, where I teach strategic talent management and also organizational design or communications, not organizational design. Sorry. By night, I am a voracious reader and kind of a learn it all human being who likes to research things for fun and write for industry blogs and articles. Uh, a little bit about how my book came to be is that I needed to get it out of my head, is the short answer. But the long answer is I've been collecting stories, people's stories for a long time. And I'm one of those people who's generally interested in hearing whatever anybody wants to tell me, whatever they have to say. I'm very interested in other people's lived experiences, the lessons that they've learned, the things they've experienced, even the traumas that they've overcome. And through doing that, I used to joke on a regular basis that someday I am going to write a book called Empathy is Not a Weakness and Other Stories from the Edge, because I wanted to share my lessons learned as well as the stories that I heard along the way in the hopes that maybe they would help somebody else.
Yeah. I love when it happens where someone's like, I jokingly said I was going to write a book about this, and then it actually happens. Like, it's incredible when it really happens. But obviously, there's a lot of work that goes into taking it from, I'm kind of collecting this information, collecting these stories, collecting this kind of framework to actually getting it done. So, at what point, was there some kind of like tipping point or transition point where you're like, all right, this isn't really a joke anymore? Like, I really think I have something here.
Well, I'm somebody who typically suffers from imposter syndrome.
Mhm.
So I went back and forth between who wants to hear my story to I think this would help a lot of people. And I used to have coffee on a regular basis with our friend Latanya Wilkins,
Mhm.
who finally wrote her book, Leading Below the Surface, also published by PYP.
Mhm.
And she told me, write the damn book already. And so that was the catalyst that put me there, because she's somebody that I can't say enough good things
Mm,
about, or I couldn't tell you how highly I think of her, because I think of her that highly.
yeah,
And if she thought that I had something, then then it was good validation for me
absolutely.
that this needed to go on paper.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And even when you and I first started talking and you said that your title was Empathy is Not a Weakness, I was like, oh my God, the world needs this book. So I think that there's applications for your book in every direction. But when you were writing it, and even now, like who is your intended audience for this book?
It's kind of twofold. So, my general purpose is ridding the world of toxic leaders and creating workspaces where people can thrive and they can innovate and they can contribute for the greater good of each other and for their organizations as a secondary component of that. But I really want to help build better human beings.
Mhm.
And the workplace seemed like the easiest place to start.
Mhm.
And just being able to help people understand that if you feel like you're low empathy, or if you feel like it's something that you struggle with, that there are tools that can help you get better at it. But on the flip side of that, the stories that make this so impactful are the stories from not just the people who overcame their inability to lead or do things with empathy, but the people who were hurt by not being treated well by somebody else are peppered throughout the book as well. And I want anybody who can resonate with those horrible stories to realize that they are not alone in the struggles that they face. So it's really twofold.
Yeah. And where do you think, and you can say to those that are watching if it's covered in your book, but where do you think empathy went off the rails in terms of being viewed as a weakness in general, in like a leadership context?
It's funny, I was just reading some research, and I think it was Business Solver study, and it said something like 70% of employees think that empathy is necessary in the workplace.
Mhm.
And on the flip side of that, I believe the stat was something like 77% of CEOs knew that empathy was important,
Mhm.
but thought they'd be seen as weak if they led with it. And
Mhm.
to me, that's a horrible thing. And I
Mhm.
think just one person in the C-suite thinking that, it's like a virus.
Yeah,
It'll go
spoils.
through the entire organization. And that's the reason that toxic leaders get promoted.
Mm. Oh, that's really interesting. I think everybody probably has, those watching and those who will eventually read your book, has some kind of story about working for some toxic leader. I don't think any of us are immune to that, I would imagine.
It's sad, but I think you're right.
Yeah,
It
it is.
it's not. Imagine how much more we could get done if we created that psychological safety that everyone's talking about now.
Mhm.
You can't have psychological safety. You can't have self awareness. You can't have any of the things that really drive collaborative and innovative workspaces or communities
Mhm.
without empathy.
Yeah. Yeah, it seems, it just seems wild that even just psychological safety, I feel like now in 2023, even 2022, it became more of like a buzzword. But the reality is that this is something, obviously, it's been discussed for a very long time, but it seems like it's just now becoming apparent that organizations maybe want to consider how safe their employees are feeling. It just seems like it's so late in the game for us to be having this conversation, but that's one of many topics that are not being addressed properly in corporate America.
Yeah, when you say it's a buzzword, that really resonates with me around the topic of empathy because what it feels like to me is whether or not it's psychologically safe.
Mm,
And if you think about engagement, especially in workplaces, a
mhm,
lot of engagement is related to a sense of belonging
mhm,
or a sense of inclusion.
mhm,
And when you feel safe, you're more likely to feel
mhm,
like you're included or you belong. And if you're treated with empathy, that means there's an openness there that allows those things to happen.
mhm. And your productivity is better, right? Because
Yes.
you're not kind of worried about who's going to say what to you or how you're going to be treated. That you can actually just focus on doing your job and maybe doing things other than your job in the workplace that help everybody.
Adding value outside of what you do every day, for sure.
Yeah, shocking concept.
Right. But I was joking this morning with somebody who I talk to on a regular basis through our LinkedIn relationship. And I was saying, there's so many things that we're talking about on a regular basis that we would think are intuitive and they're not. One
Mm.
of us should probably make a list of all the things that should be intuitive and aren't. There's another new book,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, because you don't have enough new book ideas. Let's throw another one into the mix. That's a great point, though, right? Where, yeah, to what seems obvious to me may not to you, and vice versa. And so, how do we bridge that gap between our just different perspectives that we're coming from?
With empathy. You set me up really good there. Thanks.
You bet. um, Let me ask you, because going back to kind of like just this toxicity, right? Like there's toxic environments in all industries, all directions. There's always that. Like I can think of a company that I worked for early in my career that I subsequently wrote about a lot in three separate books that I wrote because they were so toxic. And I think about what a crappy work environment that was for me and how much better I could have been and how much more I could have done if I weren't worried about just the rampant homophobia as one little example in this workplace. Knowing that you infused your story in your writing, I'm curious like what that process was for you as you were kind of like, because in some cases I'm sure it was like a little bit more surface level, not in the typical meaning of surface level, but skimming the surface of some of the story. But then there's other areas where you're definitely going deeper. So I'm curious like what that process was like for you, because we both know for the reader to really understand the power of what you're talking about, they need to see it reflected from you as the author.
Thank you for asking that question. If I could sum it up in one word, it was cathartic. But
Mm,
but the reality is, there was a lot of emotional overwhelm during the process.
mhm,
There was a lot of suffering from feeling like an imposter.
mhm,
I went from thinking if everybody would just read my book, we could make the world better together, to who the heck cares about your book? And the truth is, I didn't write it because I was trying to make money or trying to be famous. I wrote it because I want to make a difference.
mhm,
And that whole process is what was cathartic. And I had to relive some of my own trauma to put my story out there like that.
mhm,
And people who know me now are often surprised by the story.
mhm,
And that actually makes me feel good. I think it's important for people to remember who they once were,
mhm,
regardless of where you've come from. History is really important. And for me, remembering that I was lower on the spectrum of empathy
mhm,
and maybe even a little bit narcissistic at
mhm,
times is what will help me or others keep from backsliding into that, because empathy is a practice. And if you are not working it on a regular basis, it's easier to not have it. Doing empathetic things, um, behaving empathetically is a practice, and not doing it is much, much easier.
mm. And I feel like that's kind of a big component to this too. And before we went live, we were talking about how empathy is often put into the bucket of soft skills and how we need to like reframe that. So if someone's watching this or someone's reading your book and they're in some kind of position of authority, like what is the, I don't want to say business case, but like what's the thing that they need to know in order to actually recognize that this is a practice and it's not just a baseline, like you either have it or you don't.
I think it's important to recognize that it's a continuum. So
Mhm.
I've often had people say things to me like, "Well, every assessment that I've ever had says I'm low on the empathy scale." And the social workers and psychologists are probably going to come out and say something terrible because of the next words that are going to come out of my mouth. But the reality is, I don't think it can be measured in a scale like that. There's a level of situational things related to how empathetic somebody is. There is
Mhm.
a continuum of being empathetic. uh, I was reading research. I was telling Jen earlier in before we got on live that I was reading research yesterday about soldiers from countries that are known to be a little bit more violent, and how there were multiple studies done that showed that these soldiers who were in extremely violent countries were not unempathetic, that they actually had great empathy, but only empathy for their in group versus the groups that they were fighting against. And I think it's important to be aware of the impact of empathy, not just that it's on a spectrum and that it can be practiced and reflected on to make people better, but also knowing that there's a level of bias that can play into who you're empathetic to. And the in group versus out group thing is really real. And if we're practicing and reflecting in a productive way, we're going to believe other people's stories.
Mhm.
We're going to listen to other people's perspectives. If someone tells you about a trauma, you're not going to question,
Mhm.
their lived experience. If you want to create workplaces or communities or schools or cities that are more empathetic and more psychologically safe,
Mhm.
there's practices you have to focus on in order to be open enough to do those things.
Yeah. Yeah, I think the military example is such a very black and white but a good example to show because it's like you're either in or you're out. Whereas I feel like when we think about workplaces and leaders, it's so much more gray than just kind of being that black and white, like you're either part of the group or you're not part of the group. So I feel like I can see how it'd be just a challenge if it's not something someone's done before. I can see how this might be an overwhelming thing to tackle, even though it really, I feel like it doesn't seem that complicated. But at the same time, I can see why people would be overwhelmed.
Well, there's something that makes it even more real, maybe to the listeners or the readers. If you think about the whole last 3-ish years and how COVID has shaped us as a population,
Mhm.
my heart always goes out in an empathetic way to the first responders, to the nurses,
Mhm.
to the EMTs, to the doctors, to all of the people who have to work every day
Mhm.
at being empathetic because they are caring for people every single day who might need that empathy in order to live even a oodle of better life.
Mhm.
And how often we who are being treated with the utmost empathy by that population of people who do not return that favor at all.
Mhm. Yeah, that's a really good point. And I feel like the pandemic at least shined a light on the fact that just of healthcare workers in general, right? Like we should be really be more appreciative of them rather than be mad at them, perhaps because they work in a system that they have no control over.
Right. Or that they don't have enough of whatever they need to do the very best thing they can for you. Most
Mhm.
of that's out of their control.
Yeah. Do you think, I don't want to derail us too much, but do you think if we think about just using healthcare as like an example, the doctor, the nurse, the whomever that you come across that has no bedside manner whatsoever, do you think that that is what role does empathy play in that, would you guess?
I think it's a combination of things. I would I hate to put a label on something, but I often wonder about working conditions, burnout,
Mhm.
other external factors that might impact their ability to really hone back in on that empathetic
Mhm.
component.
Yeah.
Maybe everyone can only go so far, so fast for so long. And there are so many external factors that play into things on a daily basis, which again is why practicing, it's not going to make you perfect at it.
Mhm.
You're still going to not be great some days, and other days you're going to be really great. And it's important to recognize and give yourself a little bit of grace
Mhm.
around just trying to make an effort every single day, a little bit at a time.
Yeah. I would imagine this is probably like just a great industry as an example of what you were just saying. Like it's a skill that you have to practice because you could have a nurse who is the most empathetic, loving, and emits the most positive energy of a human being, and then just has a real rough day and then treats that one person without the empathy that's kind of expected. And then they're kind of labeled as like, well, that person didn't give, like, has no bedside manner, and they're all kind of upset. But really, you're not taking into the totality that that person, all those other external factors that you're talking about. So it's just kind of interesting to think about. It is a practice. It's not just you're always going to be this way. Like some days you might have more empathy, some days you might have less empathy, and it really just kind of depends on a lot of factors.
Well, I think about traffic, right?
Yeah.
So it's easy to get mad in traffic
Hmm.
and if somebody cuts you off, but you also don't know what's happening
Hmm.
in that other person's life or in their car. Maybe their water broke and they're rushing to the hospital because their significant other isn't there to drive them
Yeah.
and they're trying not to have a baby in the car. You just don't know what's going on with somebody else. And I think it's important to remember that if you're working at being empathetic.
Hmm. Yeah, I think that's something that we should be teaching and training our like the younger generations to like really be mindful of. I know that I was driving just in my town. I live in a small town, and at the stoplight, someone came flying past me and like flipped me off and kept moving. And I was like, what? Like, I was so baffled because I was just sitting at the light and they were going the other way. And my son was getting all worked up about it. And I'm like, we have no idea we don't know. Like, we genuinely don't know what is happening with that car. Like, they did not impact me in the least. We are here. We are safe. I don't know what their problem is. And like, it's just those little, I think, micro moments to just kind of say exactly what you just said, where it's like, you don't actually know what's going on. And it's not fair for us to try to even guess or speculate or judge what is going on. We just need to try to focus on ourselves and how we can show up more empathetically.
We're masters at telling ourselves stories
Mm-hmm.
and then getting sucked into those stories and believing the narrative that's often false in our own heads. I actually had a friend describe it as if we're holding on to broken glass
Mm,
and then we get upset and we just squeeze that glass in our hand.
that's such a good visual. It's so true, though. I don't know. Have you done Landmark by any chance, or any of like heard anything about Landmark?
No.
It's like self-help, self-improvement. Like it's just a really very fairly well-known worldwide program. And I did one of their programs sometime maybe 2021. And there's a whole thing about stories, right? So like you have on one side it's what happened, like it's the facts of what happened. And then the other side is the story that you're telling yourself. And then somewhere in the middle is the actual reality of what really happened. And I think about that all the time. Like even my partner and I were just having a conversation the other night, and I was like, I think that's a story you're telling yourself, because that's not like, I didn't say that, but like what you're hearing is something that you're like, it's actually a story. And like, because we have like that shared common language, we're able to kind of just work through things quickly. But it's just kind of interesting because I think when you put that story into the mix, you're adding judgment, you're adding all kinds of just unproductive and unhelpful things. And you translate that into the workplace, and I feel like all bets are off.
I love that you brought up the word judgment, because I often get asked, how do I know if I have a problem with empathy?
Hmm.
And my first response to that question is, how often are you feeling judgmental?
Hmm. Interesting. Yeah, they're hand in hand, aren't they? Hmm. Would you put them on like this a spectrum, like where there's judgment all the way on one side and empathy all the way on another side?
I don't know if I'd pull it that far apart,
Mm-hmm.
because it depends on what the judgment is about, but it's more about being curious and investigating what is going on in your own head.
Mm-hmm.
And I would say flawed thinking is probably at one end and empathy is probably at the other. I
Yeah.
would have to really think about that deeper to create a spectrum. I'm sure somebody's created a spectrum somewhere out in the psychological community, but
Yeah.
uh,
And if not,
I
it's for
think
your next book.
right, there we go, another book. I think it's really important to understand that there is not anybody who does this perfectly every single day, every day of their lives, in every moment. And small steps are good.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, in kind of wrapping things up, could you provide one simple small step that someone might be able to take like right now or today to get them a little bit closer to being more empathetic?
I think the first thing you can do is just reflect on, when was the last time that you felt like you were empathetic, and write about that,
Mm-hmm.
and pinpoint what about it made you think that you were empathetic. And on the other side of that is, when was the last time you felt like a victim or were victimized by somebody? And as you explore that, ask yourself what stories you told yourself during that process, whether there was anything you could have recognized, whether there was anything different that you could have done in that moment.
Mm-hmm.
And if you find yourself placing blame, all of the blame, on the other person, that's a key indicator that you're going to need deeper reflection.
Mm-hmm. It's very, very well said. um, I want to just point out, so we're, book launch mode. Here we are. Your book is available wherever anyone would like to buy books. So wherever your favorite bookstore, favorite online retailer, have at, go, you do you. However, bookshop.org happens to be online independent books retailer that serves the independent bookstore community super, super well. And I love them so much. And they have like just a big philanthropic tie-in. They're also a B Corp, which is what PYP is. So we're committed to like high sustainable standards, environmentally friendly practices, all those things. So if you don't have a favorite bookstore, my point being is go to bookshop.org. And the link for that is in wherever you're watching this, there's a link below it. But I know, Loren, that you created these, I don't want to say fancy t-shirts, but it sounds like they're very like amazing quality. And so if anyone buys your book today and just sends you the confirmation, regardless of where they've purchased the book, they will be entered to win a raffle for said shirt. Is that correct?
That is correct. It's a adorable graphic that was created by my daughter, who's a graphic artist, and it says, powered by people, empowered by empathy. And in the center, there is a light bulb with a stick figure flexing its muscles as the filament.
That sounds perfect. And I think, if you're watching this video, and there's been a number of people who've been watching the entire time that we've been here, it means that, and there's Laura and Kathy both specifically singing your praises, by the way, Loren, in the comments. But if you're watching this and you've been sticking around with us, clearly there's something about this topic that is resonating. So in my opinion, why not go get the book and then be entered into the raffle? So Loren, do we have your email address that we can share? Or how are you collecting these confirmations?
They can email it to me, and my email is Loren, it's LORENJ Sanders @gmail.com.
Very simple to remember. I like it.
Thank you.
Oh, this has been so great, Loren. I really appreciate it. It always just brings me so much joy when we're at the place where the book is out, because we've been working on it for what feels like forever sometimes. But in your case, like I'm so excited about this topic and how you frame this topic, because I really feel like it's going to help a lot of people. So I'm very grateful for you and for trusting us in this process.
Thank you so much, Jen.
Yeah, you're welcome. All right. So I will talk to you soon, Loren. And for everybody else, I will be back at another point in the future talking to somebody else with their book launch. But in the meantime, go check out Loren's book. Again, bookshop.org is my favorite place, but you can get it wherever you would like to. And I will see you very soon.
Thank you for